Hi guys, it's Troy at The Full Setup, back with another benchmark review. Now in today's video, I will be benchmarking a brand new RTX 2060 with the Ryzen 2600. For my last video, we benchmarked the 2060's outstanding 1080p performance, but for today's video, I will be cranking the resolution up to 1440p. So will the 2060 be the new bang for buck 2K gaming champ? Let's find out. I will be testing 11 games with a mix of stock and overclock results for you. Over the next few weeks, I will also be benchmarking 4K and ultra-wide performance, and have some upcoming i5-8400 tests as many of you have been requesting them. So if you want to see those videos, make sure you hit the subscribe button. As for the RTX 2060, I'm using the Palette Gaming Pro OC with 6GB of GDDR6. This RTX 2060 is using a bin GPU, so as you can see here, it's actually boosting way above its 1830MHz max boost rating, and for the most is running between 1935 and 2000 MHz. As for today's test system, I'm using a Ryzen 2600 with 16 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4. Now I've got full manual subtiming set and I'm running at 14, 14, 14, 30, and that's running on an Asus X370 Crosshair motherboard. I'm using a 600 watt power supply, but you should be fine with a 450 to 500 watt unit. Let's start with stock versus overclock performance. As already mentioned, this card is boosting rather high, so I was only able to add 110 MHz to the core. As for the memory, I had a couple of crashes at 1000 MHz, just like the previous test, so I've dropped it down to 900 for this benchmark. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I am running at ultra settings with SMAA enabled. With both the Ryzen 2600 and RTX 2060 at stock settings, we have a minimum of 52 and an average of 62 frames per second. Overclocking the RTX 2060 scores a minimum of 57 and an average of 67 frames per second. Running the Ryzen 2600 to 4.2 GHz, but with the GPU at stock, scores a minimum of 51 and an average of 63 frames per second. Running both the CPU and GPU overclocked, scores a minimum of 57 and an average of 68 frames per second. Moving on to Far Cry 5, again at ultra settings with SMAA enabled. For all stock, we have a minimum of 71 and an average of 81 frames per second. Overclocking the GPU scores a minimum of 78 and an average of 87 frames per second. Overclocking the CPU but leaving the GPU stock results with minimums of 73 and averages of 81 frames per second. And finally, we have the entire system overclocked. Minimums are at 78 and averages are at 88 frames per second. So there were very little gains from overclocking the CPU due to the GPU being the bottleneck in the system. That's not to say there are no gains from overclocking your CPU. If you're like myself playing shooters at lower settings to max out your panel's refresh rate, you may want to give overclocking a try. But for the rest of the benchmark except Battlefield 5, I will be running the Ryzen 2600 at stock settings. But I will be running the GPU overclocked, and as mentioned many times, this is because I use Shadow Play to record. So basically you're gaining 5% gains from overclocking, but then you're hitting the record button which gives you a 5% hit in performance. So technically what you're seeing on screen is much closer to stock performance than it actually is overclocked GPU performance. As mentioned in my 1080p video, Forza Horizon 4 has some much needed Ryzen optimizations versus Motorsport 7, and at ultra settings frame rates were always averaging between 80 and 90 frames per second. Now for the first part of this PUBG footage, I'm running at the settings that I mostly play on, so this is everything set to low except view distance, which has been set to ultra, and this system has no issues running frame rates over 100 frames per second. But as you can see, there is definitely some bottlenecking happening with the system here, so if you do play at competitive settings, I would recommend overclocking your CPU for this game. Cranking the settings to ultra though, but still with low AA, and you can see the system has no trouble keeping the frame rates above 60, with averages for the most always in the mid 80s. Now Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a game that can have a really varied frame rate, depending on location and intensity of gameplay. So I'd be really interested on what settings you use, so let me know in the comments section below. For me, I've gone for slightly high frame rate over visual fidelity, so at high settings with low AA, my frame rate for the most is always above 60, and that's sort of where I like to play this game. Moving on to Black Ops 4 at very high settings with medium AA. After the horrendous lack of footage for the last video, I opted for playing a few rounds with One Shot, who is a regular on our Discord server and runs the benchmark channel Rules of Entertainment. He's uploaded loads of Ryzen 1600 RTX 2060 benchmarks over the last few days, so I highly recommend you check them out, and there is a link in the description to his channel. Anyway, back to Black Ops 4, this system has no issues running at 1440p. Very high settings, medium 8A, and just look at the frame rates, always averaging between 80 and 100 frames per second. Drop it down to medium or low and you're going to be gaming at way over 100 frames per second on this title. For Grand Theft Auto 5, I'm running at stock GPU settings, and as with Tomb Raider and Far Cry, scores were taken when not recording. At ultra settings with FXAA enabled and advanced graphics turned off, the 2060 scores a minimum of 48 and an average of 101 frames per second, so there is loads of headroom to turn up the settings a little bit more there. Finally, time to test some ray tracing. I have a whole bunch of Battlefield 5 footage for you at various settings, so I'm just going to let this run and then come back with my final thoughts on the 2060 and its 1440p performance.
Objective Anton. We've taken objective Caesar, soldiers. Attention! Objective data has been lost! What are you? Objective Bertha taken.
So there was the Battlefield 5 footage, and I decided to keep DXR settings to low throughout. Now the frame rates were okay for some of the tests, but for me it was really the frame rates and stutters that just do not make it an enjoyable experience for me. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record for all these Battlefield 5 tests that I do, but DirectX 11 is how I will be continuing to play Battlefield. And this rig, once set up, once you get them full manual memory timing set, really does excel at both low and ultra 1440p settings. That being said, I am really looking forward to testing more RTX titles when they are released, and when I have enough games I will make a dedicated 2060 ray tracing video for you. As for non-RTX games, and ignoring the second-hand market, I think the 2060 is an absolute champ for 1440p gaming. When the 1060 launched, it was a total beast for 1080p, with what I would say as good 1440p performance, while the 2060 is a frame-smashing 1080p GPU. And to be honest, I think it's a bit of a beast at 1440p. It has no problems delivering 60 FPS at high to ultra settings in large open world games, and can offer 100 FPS and up in shooters. Drop a setting or two and you have a seriously cheap 2K 144Hz graphics card on your hands. Anyway, I'd be interested on what your thoughts are. Do you still think the 6 series is too expensive, or now that you've seen the 1440p performance, do you think this is a bit of a beast as well? Anyway, that's it from me today. I would be really interested on your thoughts. Do you think the RTX 2060 is a beast for 1440p, or do you still think that it's too expensive? If you like the video, leave a like. If you dislike the video, tell me why, and I'll be back with some more benchmarks very soon.